It was like any other seaman's chest on the outside. The initial B burned on the top of it with a hot iron, and the corners somewhat smashed and broken, as by long, rough usage. A strong smell of tobacco and tar rose from the interior, but nothing was to be seen on top except a suit of very good clothes, carefully brushed and folded. They had never been worn, my mother said. Under that, the miscellany began. A quadrant, a tin cannikin, several sticks of tobacco, 2 brace of very handsome pistols, a piece of bar silver, an old Spanish watch and some other trinkets of little value and mostly foreign make, a pair of compasses mounted with brass, and 5 or 6 curious West Indian shells. It has often set me thinking since that he should have carried about these shells with him in his wandering, guilty, and hunted life. So reads the description of the seaman's chest owned by Billy Bones, the pirate from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. But just how accurate is it to where a real 18th century pirate would have kept his stuff? Stevenson did his research. In 1883, maritime life wasn't all too different from 2 centuries prior. Throughout his life, he was able to interact with sailors both young and old, to learn of the customs at sea. Chests are almost as old as civilization itself. The idea of keeping your precious belongings tucked away safely in a sturdy, waterproof container has proved appealing to the earliest of men. Some of the oldest chests come from the grave of Tutankhamun. These were made of ebony, cedar, and ivory, and quite exquisite in their design. We can imagine that the average Joe of this time and before would have used something more rudimentary. A wooden log roughly cut, hollowed out, and furnished with a lid. Chests are usually heavy, oftentimes difficult to carry by more than one person. While this could be seen as a detriment, it could also be a benefit. Heavy wooden chests were difficult to steal, turning them into a progenitor of the modern safe. Neither are intricate locks and keys a new invention, and could even be made out of wood. Upon the open ocean, where the wind howls and the waves cradle you to sleep, a heavier chest is less likely to glide around and crush everything around it. The seaman's chest as we know it began to take shape in the 17th century. They evolved from the blanket chest, an ancient form of furniture used for all kinds of household storage. Initially they were but a box with an undivided compartment and a lid, before being fitted with various trays and dividers intended for certain contents. In the Western world, they were usually made of cedar, its pungent smell being a deterrent against beetles starving for your linens. Before closets became widespread in the 19th century, chests were the only common furniture. Aboard the 1620 Mayflower, they were the only furniture to be found aboard. Sailors' chests were reflective of their conditions aboard the ship. Most of them lived in the forecastle, the front of the ship, a crowded and unstable compartment taking head-on the punches and tackles of Neptune. Here the sailors slept in bunks or hammocks, before the 1680s, on the naked floor, and it was utterly devoid of any seating or storage. The sea chest served the purpose of both. It was where a man could keep his belongings and where he could have a seat. A group of sailors could crowd around it on their knees and use the lid as a table to have a meal, a drink, or play games. The majority of seamen's chests were of the 6-board variety. 1 plank makes up the bottom, 4 planks the walls around it, and the last one the lid. It is as humble as it gets. The overlid we're so used to was uncomfortable to sit on, unless if you have an oddly shaped butt, I suppose, and the overlid was useless as a table. However, many sea chests would be constructed with their sides sloping inward, providing it with a wider base and better stability in rough winds and weather. The most common material was pine, since it was cheap and available in wide planks. The planks were joined by dovetails, the ends of the planks cut with a series of pins shaped like dovetails, and these interlocked with the tails of the other planks and fastened with glue. The bottom of the chest was nailed on and reinforced with a skirtboard. The lid was flat and fixed with simple butt hinges. In a few 19th century examples, pictures of ships can be found on the inside of the lid, and other decorations were doubtlessly made. Naturally, the chest was supplied with a lock, most of them probably quite cheap and simple, with the more complex locks reserved for treasure chests. The interior of the chest was usually furnished with a tray or compartment on the right-hand side, but otherwise tended to lack further trays or dividers. To lift the chest, the sides were furnished with beckets, a short bit of rope passed through a wooden cleat. Sea chests were seldom decorated, but a sailor might spend his downtime weaving a delicate becket, using spare bits of line or sail canvas. The result was a sturdy and resistant piece of furniture, usually with a height of around 17 inches, 43 centimeters, the same as the height of a chair, indicating their usual purpose. The simplicity of the chest made it friendly to customization, perhaps adding a frilled cloth on the lid, painting or lacquering the wood, adding legs, a cloth lining, leather protection on the corners. Finally, the sailor would mark his initials into the lid or front of the chest. Apart from written documentations, this can be seen on this image from 1743, The Sailor's Parting by C. Mosley. How the initials were marked I do not know, perhaps by carving or perhaps by branding iron, as told in Treasure Island. So, what might we expect to find inside of a sailor's chest? Most apparently would be clothing. Clothes were the most necessary of a sailor's possessions, and oftentimes they owned nothing but the clothes on their backs, moving from paycheck to paycheck, ship to ship, even selling their spare clothes to buy a swig or swive. Spare clothes were an absolute must. Work aboard a ship was wet. Your clothes would get soaked by sweat, rain, or a rough wave, and a change was a must for comfort and hygiene. Sailors going to bed in wet clothes was a huge problem throughout the period. The clothes would otherwise rip, tear, wear down, and break. Linen isn't always the most sturdy material, especially when hand-sewn by insufficient skill or a bad wage. The sailors had to learn how to mend and patch their own clothes. A small sewing kit was probably found among most sailors' possessions. Neither was it easy to acquire new clothes. The clever sailor would buy them cheaply before going to sea, and it seems that many preferred to do it with a female friend, possibly because back then they tended to know more seamstresses, weavers, and had more relevant skills than the average man. But if he forgot, as they often did, lazy buggers, the shipboard purser would sell sailors' clothes, so-called slops, at a very steep rate. This rate was usually taken out of the sailor's wage, and they were often put in debt. The purser also sold alcohol and tobacco. Pirates would employ a similar system. Clothing of all sorts, fine and unrefined, was put into the so-called common chest and auctioned out at the mainmast. They would steal clothes, and in some cases, pirate codes allowed for each pirate a fresh change of garments, for free. This highlights the constant need for good and clean clothing aboard any ship. We actually have a detailed document from 1723 describing the possessions of pirates Piers and Andrew Cullen, brothers and part of Captain Roch's crew. The list marks a near endless number of articles: shirts, 1 coat, 4 waistcoats, 2 breeches, 2 nightcaps, pairs of stockings, 6 cravats, several handkerchiefs, 2 wigs. I like the presence of a towel, a must-have for anyone in the field. You can use it to quickly wipe away some sweat. Some of the items were undoubtedly intended to be sold. Clothes were a very valuable plunder. Besides clothing, bedding was a common item found in sea chests. These included mattresses, blankets, and pillows, either to be used in a hammock or upon a naked deck. The wealthier sailor would possess pillowcases and bed sheets. Just like clothing, bedding was sold by the ship's purser. It was rare for a sailor to own little more than clothes and bedding. Their total assets could often be worth as little as £10 or less. There is likely a reason for satirist Ned Ward to have written the following: "If he have money or credit, or but a rag to his buttocks, he'll part with all, to purchase a sucking bout at night, where he drinks to the memory of his concubines so heartily." Aside from these necessities, sailors would keep other private items of their choosing. Contrary to popular belief, many sailors were literate, There are preserved documents, usually round robins, where large pirate companies have all signed their names. Books usually included Bibles and prayer books, but also books for navigation like atlases or wagoners. Andrew Cullen possessed an arithmetic book, signed with his name. They also had texts and journals on seamanship, or simply books to be read for pleasure. Sailors, pirates and privateers did read the works of others of their kind, as indicated by a couple of examples. In his account of the Pacific adventure, Buccaneer William Dick makes a reference to Exquemelin's Buccaneers of America. In 1725, a newspaper remarked how the officers and seamen of the HMS Swallow had read about their own pirate hunting exploits in the General History of the Pirates. Of course, many pirates showed hostility towards books. Fragments of a journal was found as wadding inside one of Blackbeard's cannons. William Snellgrave documented how his books were thrown overboard by his pirate captors. Other personal items included wooden plates or mugs, cutlery, dice and cards, navigational tools, walking canes, and jewelry like rings. Aside from work clothes, pirates would have possessed finer clothing, which they wore when sauntering about in port, a buxom babe in the crook of his arm. They would also have trade goods they could potentially sell: pearls, jewels, cloth, trinkets, sugar and spice. Naturally, they would have some, if not all of the money with them. If they had more money, it could be kept on shore, in a bank, safeguarded by a trusted person, or maybe even buried in a secluded location. Items of hygiene were quite often found among sailors and pirates. The Cullen brothers were described as owning 3 razors between them, and a hound, a sharpening stone. In the wreck of the Elizabeth and Mary were found a number of combs, all made of ivory, an expensive material. And combs were not only used to make your hair look nice, but also for delousing. For a pirate, the most notable possessions would have been their weapons and their tobacco. Unlike regular sailors, pirates and privateers had to buy and maintain their own armaments. Muskets, the pirate's favorite arm, was too big to keep inside of a chest, and might have been kept next to or lashed to it, or marked and kept collectively in the gunner's locker. Smaller arms like swords, daggers and pistols could certainly be kept in the chest. And pistols were kept in special cases, furnished with a cloth lining and always holding a pair, known as a brace. It is possible that pirates kept their pistols rolled up in bags made of hemp. Tobacco was usually kept in a dedicated pouch, and the most common mode of consumption was smoking through a pipe. Wooden pipes were of poor quality and uncommon until the 19th century. Instead, clay pipes were preferred. They are brittle, and if unprotected will usually break in a bag or chest. So pirates and sailors would keep them in dedicated cases. Especially cute are these pistol-shaped pipe holders from the wreck of the Dauphin, a privateer ship from France. Now, the list of potential items is virtually endless, but remember that a sailor had to carry all of these around in a limited space, often defined by what he himself could carry. So a pirate would have drifted towards possessing less rather than more. The clothes on his back, his spare clothes, his weapons, and the equipment to maintain them. Indeed, sea chests were heavy and took up a lot of space. When preparing for battle, they had to be stowed in the ship's hold to clear the decks. Random clutter was dangerous and blocked the men from moving about. And pirates often sailed on very small ships and preferred to keep them as light as possible. Some even sailed in simple canoes and piraguas, where there was barely any space for spare provisions. On merchant ships, sea chests took up space, which could be used for cargo instead. So it's very likely that sea chests were shared, probably between consorts, 2 men with a signed agreement to share possessions. Or perhaps even in a mess, a work group of around 6 men. William Snellgrave wrote how his pirate captors always kept their ships cleared for action, indicating that they had no hammocks and no sea chests, or that the chests were kept in the hold. And few sailors and pirates probably owned enough possessions to even warrant the use of such a large and cumbersome item. If a pirate crew had a chest, it was probably only one, used for keeping treasure. But above all, In the great cabin was a large chest, so heavy that 5 or 6 men could be just draw it along the deck, full of pigs of silver, bags of pieces of 8, and some gold. Treasure chests are closely interlinked with the romanticism of pirates, and indeed, they were to be found aboard almost any ship, though seldom in large numbers owing to their weight. They were essentially safes or strong boxes for keeping the most valuable possessions. The most notable example might be the purported treasure chest of Thomas II, nowadays kept in the Pirates' Soul Museum and White Gallery. Made of iron, and probably of German or Dutch craftsmanship, it weighs in at 150 pounds, 68 kilos, when empty. One can only imagine its total weight when loaded with treasure. As you can see, it can hold a lot of possessions. One can only imagine what East Indian treasures Captain II would have loaded it with, from his adventures across the Red Sea and Madagascar. The bottom of the chest is supplied with a small case, where the captain would have kept some especially valuable items. The chest is also ornate, with figures of mermaids worked into the design. But most impressive is perhaps the lock mechanism, concealed in the interior of the lid by this ornate cage. The front panel even has a dummy keyhole, to deceive any would-be thieves or lock breakers. It is very likely that chests of this kind would not have been private property of the pirate captain, but used instead to safeguard all of the treasure owned collectively by the crew, before it was to be divided. The captain and officers led a more luxurious existence than the crew in the forecastle, but not by much. The living standards were still quite Spartan, with the cabin seldom being able to house more than a bunk bed, a desk, and a chest. It did, however, allow their chests to take up more interesting space, and their higher wages allowed them to have more specialized stuff in them. Some chests were designed to hold the captain's liquor, including flasks, carafes, and glasses. Gold and silver are what all pirates coveted, but sometimes the lives they held dear were not worth risking it. Dreams of pearls and jewels grow less appealing when life fades from you, or your mind grows dull and weak from disease. Pirates were always on the lookout for medicine. Aboard a ship, the surgeon kept these innumerable and arcane curatives inside of a specialized chest, the surgeon's chest, or medicine chest. After his crew was struck by syphilis, Blackbeard blockaded the city of Charleston, simply to acquire one of these containers and attempt to cure his men. Ned Lowe operated in a similar manner, taking French sailors and hostages, and exchanging them for a medicine chest at St. Croix. The regular sailor would have kept his possessions almost immediately upon his person. Small possessions could be kept inside of pockets, or sewn into his clothes like pants, waistcoats, and coats. Clothes could also be fashioned with secret compartments. Some pistols were small enough to be kept in a hat, and money could be sewn into clothes. Belts were not used to secure your pants, which most often had a lacing. Instead, belts were used to hold up various bags and pouches. These included money bags, tobacco pouches, and larger boxes used for holding assorted items, and even those dedicated to holding ammunition. For larger items, dedicated bags were needed. Some sailors would simply have used their own hammocks, tucking their possessions into a blanket, tying it up, wrap the hammock around it, and haul it upon their shoulder. Dedicated bags or sacks were also used, and some of the most popular sailors' possessions. Indeed, they were probably more common than sea chests, since they held just enough stuff to be moved around comfortably, didn't take up space aboard a ship, and could easily be cleared. You could also use them as a comfortable seat, a pillow, and perhaps even as a sleeping bag. According to most written evidence, these bags were made of canvas and striped. Pierce and Andrew Cullen, the pirate brothers, possessed between them 3 blue and white bags. It sounds pretty much identical to the sack found on the Sailor's Farewell, right below the sea chest. It seems to have a blue body with black checkers and a white checkered top. The opening of the bag appears to be secured with thread. These sacks wouldn't have been comfortable to carry, just slung onto the back and held with a hand, or tied to the end of a stick or musket, and carried hobo style. The best way would be to have two bags tied together, one slung onto the back, the other over your belly, to provide a counterweight. The possessions of P.S. and Andrew Cullen were kept inside of portmanteaus. These were leather pieces of luggage that split open, and were carried by a handle in the middle. They are still quite popular today, but it's uncertain how often they were used by pirates and sailors. The ones for keeping the brothers' possessions may simply have been an item of the authorities. My favorite kind of bag is the Snapsack, known by a variety of strange names, including haversack, knapsack, and sausage bag, because it does kinda look like a sausage. It is a waterproofed canvas or leather bag, shaped like a cylinder, and closed on one end and open at the other. The open end is closed with a lacing. A strap runs along the side of the bag. The strap is used for carrying the sack, most often over the chest or shoulder. And some of the straps had buckles for adjusting. The Snapsacks are quite comfortable and flexible, and allow you to shift them around as you please. It's also easy to carry multiple bags with them. They were also cheap and easy to produce. A London leather seller in 1645 was able to produce as many as 500 in a 10-day period. The Snapsack is quite old, seemingly dating back to the Middle Ages, and originally being used to carry food. They are related to the haversack, a simple bag like the ones I take to the grocery store. A sack with a strap running over the opening, and with a flap lid or cover. These were originally used to carry fodder for horses. The names Snapsack and knapsack derives from the Dutch knapzak, knap meaning food and zak meaning sack, so literally food sack. The Snapsack became the favorite carrying method for 17th century soldiers, and by proxy, the favorite of the Buccaneers. These were essentially Protestant paramilitaries in the Caribbean who attacked Spanish cities from the sea. They borrowed much of their organization, tactics, and equipment from conventional forces, and many of them had served in Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army. In 1645, the NMA was contracted for a total of 20,400 Snapsacks. Many of these were undoubtedly brought to the Caribbean. Snapsacks were documented in the possession of Buccaneers. William Dampier mentions them in passing. While we were landing and fixing our Snapsacks to march, our Mosquito Indians struck a plentiful dish of fish. This casual mention of the Snapsack, and lack of mention elsewhere, indicates that it was as natural and common a piece of equipment as to not warrant mention nor description. Historian Benerson Little speculates that Buccaneers would have carried between 40 to 60 pounds, that's 18 to 27 kilos, worth of equipment in their Snapsacks, mostly provisions. What kind of items would we find inside? The Buccaneers would have carried stuff useful for their expeditions on land, not very much different from what regular sailors would have carried. A lot of their possessions would be kept outside of the bag. If we look at this eyewitness illustration of a filibuster from around 1687, we can see that he has a pistol in his pocket, a pouch upon his belt, and a mosquito net tied around his belly. This would have been put over his face when sleeping. And pouches could be used to carry ammunition, gunflints, pipes, and tobacco. It also appears as if the filibuster carries a Snapsack, quite small, and slung over a single shoulder. Inside the Snapsack, the Buccaneers might keep some spare clothes, allowing for a fresh and dry change in the humid, sweaty march. But it would probably get wet just as quickly, with next to no opportunities of drying them. They might have had a flint and fire steel for striking a fire, perhaps a blanket and pillow for sleeping. Provisions were the most important, since they were expected to march long distances, potentially without cooking. Water would have been the most heavy. You might have carried spare water in a large container in the bag, but water was also kept in a personal flask, tied to a string or sling and slung around the shoulder. Thus you had access to a quick drink when marching. Buccaneers might have used the round wooden flasks popular with soldiers, but several Buccaneers documented how they used calabashes, a gourd. These gourds were originally of native craft, and often painted intricately. On many occasions, water needed not be carried in large quantities, as it could easily be foraged. Basil Ringrose, when marching in Panama, wrote the following: "And as for drink, the rivers afforded them enough." Food usually included meat and bread. The meat would have been boucan or barbecue, essentially beef jerky. Thin strips of meat, salted and smoked over a wooden grill, until gaining a deep red color and achieving the consistency of leather. Boucan is the namesake of the Buccaneers, and it was their favorite provision. They also ate cakes of bread boiled in the ship's cauldron, essentially a dumpling called a doughboy. These were smeared with fat: oil, butter, lard, or turtle fat. Basil Ringrose mentions how his Buccaneers had 3 or 4 of these doughboys in their bags. It's unlikely that the Buccaneers would have had much more in their bags, since they preferred to go light and needed space for plunder. They would also be accompanied by slaves who carried their heavier possessions. Soldiers would usually carry cooking equipment: pots, pans, cutlery, but pirates probably scorned these in favor of eating processed food, the doughboys and barbecue. If fresh meat was acquired, it was usually prepared into barbecue. Doughboys were preferred over ship's biscuit, since it could be made aboard a ship and didn't need preparation like the biscuit. It wouldn't have lasted as long as the ship's biscuit, but the Buccaneers often foraged, acquiring provisions by stealing or purchasing it from native allies. I'm not certain how popular snapsacks were with regular sailors, but among the Buccaneers, it was certainly a favorite. Lest he wanted to get lost, a wise Buccaneer might carry with him his charts and maps. Many of the Buccaneers I've mentioned, Ringrose and Dampier, wrote journals of their adventures, and need to carry with them paper and pen. These would have been susceptible to the elements, or simply bruising and tearing from being carried with other items. Luckily, Dampier provided an eloquent description of how he carried his journal. Foreseeing a necessity of wading through rivers frequently in our land march, I took care before I left the ship to provide myself a large joint of bamboo, which I stopped at both ends, closing it with wax so as to keep out any water. In this I preserved my journal and other writings from being wet, though I was often forced to swim. I reckon that such containers could be used to keep any valuable documents, like maps, ship's articles, letters, and commissions. I hope you enjoyed this video covering where a pirate would have kept his stuff. Large parts of it were based on my own experience, not only from marching in the armed forces, but also camping and reenactment with period equipment. A dear friend of mine was actually so kind as to make me a snapsack back in August, and I used it quite frequently to carry heavy loads of equipment, over the hills and far away. If you want to support Gold Gunpowder, please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. For as little as $1 a month, Patreon supporters get access to all of my videos early and without ads. I also have a merch store where you can buy clothing or stickers with authentic pirate flags. Please enjoy, and I'll see you again soon.